Can you hear me? Is this working? Yeah? Okay. Good morning, friends, colleagues, and our very distinguished guests. I am extremely pleased to open this session this morning. My name is Jyoti Sangera, and I am the Chief of Section on Economic Social Issues at OHCHR in the Research and Right to Development branch. We've had one day of deliberation, some very, very interesting conversations, and we start this day today with new, fresh energy in the hope that we will advance that conversation and that people will feel free and energized to put their points in front of everybody here. I am the moderator, and I am going to just ensure that we keep to our time. We must finish this session after an hour and a half. To my right is one of the members of the working group, Mr. Pavel Sulian-Ziga. Pardon me if I haven't said that properly. We have a speakers list at the desk right there behind me. So the speakers list will be open till the end of the panel. When the panelists finish their presentations, the speakers list will close. So kindly have your names registered at the speakers list. The purpose of doing that is to ensure that we have a good mix of stakeholders and that we can get stakeholders to speak by kind of making that mix. From the floor, we would expect you to make your comments in 2 minutes or under, just to ensure then, once again, that the list, if it's long enough, everybody gets a chance to speak. And you are sort of not encouraged to make written statements. If you have written statements, kindly give them to my colleagues there or to my colleague sitting right behind me, Gunnar. The Secretariat will be very pleased to register these written statements and to put them on our website. We have a rapporteur, we have my colleagues amongst you, we have focal points, so the session will be well covered in terms of taking down the key points that are being made here. I am now going to introduce to you the two facilitators of the session who will then introduce the panelists and also facilitate the conversation with the panelists in a question-answer session. So the facilitator on my left is Mr. Chris Avery. Chris is the Director of Business and Human Rights Resource Center, which is an independent NGO that tracks reports of the human rights impacts, both positive and negative, of some 5,100 companies in 190 countries, and seeks responses from companies when concerns are raised by civil society. The center also provides tools and resources for all those working in the field. And the center's website includes special portals on the UN Guiding Principles and on the UN Working Group. The facilitator on my right is Mariette van Hoyste, who is a researcher at SOMO, the Center for Research on Multinational Corporations. She's also the coordinator of the Corporate Accountability Team at SOMO, and in that capacity following the business and human rights discussions at the United Nations. So today, we will be focusing our conversation with our panelists and with you on how human rights are being integrated into the work of businesses. So over to Chris and to Mariette. Thank you.
For this introduction, and Chris and I are very grateful that you are willing to moderate this session, so thanks. It is my honor to introduce to you our first panelist, here on my left, Guana Quaitel, who is the program director of Connect Us, and Connect Us is a non-governmental organization based in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Connect Us' mission is to promote the realization of human rights and the consolidation of the rule of law in the Global South. Guana is a lawyer and holds postgraduate degrees in international human rights law and political science. She is also the associate editor of SUR, which is the International Journal on Human Rights. So, as program director at Connect Us, you meet a lot of civil society representatives, also through the trainings, the South-South trainings Connect Us is organizing. And can you describe the opinions about the guiding principles and the uptake of the guiding principles in your network?
Okay. Gracias. Buen día a todos y muchas gracias a la Alta Comisión.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much to the High Commissioner. Thank you very much to the OHCHR and to SOMA for their invitation. I would also like to thank you for having thought of a panel version for this session, which I find better and more friendly. When I received the invitation, I accepted this invitation because Connect Us recently organized the International Colloquium on Human Rights. One of the topics was development and human rights, or making sure that there was corporate social responsibility in terms of human rights. The International Colloquium, it's a training event for the Southern Hemisphere. We have gathered 100 people in São Paulo, and we had previous training online. We read the Guiding Principles, which was one of our duties before this session met. We also asked our members whether they thought the Guiding Principles were relevant in their work for ensuring corporate social responsibility. Were they useful, and did they think that there were any weaknesses, and how they thought they could overcome these weaknesses? Perhaps the first response was one of these. What was the feedback that we had from a group of 60 human rights activists from the south of more than 30 countries? The first aspect is that amongst the human rights activists from the Southern Hemisphere, there are organizations that are very pertinent. There are organizations which are very pertinent in each of their countries, and in the colloquium we tried to make sure that there was a national level organization and make sure that they worked at the national level. The professionals that came worked in different organizations and are about 30 and have been working for more than 30 years on the topic of development and human rights. Most of them did not know the guiding principles, in fact. They learnt of the guiding principles for the first time when they had to participate in the colloquium. For me, it was a surprise because 67% of the people said that these guiding principles could be useful for their work. And here I would like to make an appeal. The people that did not respond are the people that work directly with companies. Most of the people worked on human rights in general, with torture and different processes in our community. But there were two participants, one that works with tobacco control and the other one which works with technological industries, with ICTs. They said that these were not useful to them. The content was not pertinent for them and would not help in corporate social responsibility. But they were really in the minority. Most people said that, yes, they were useful. I would like to bring up the fact that most people were looking into how to make these binding, either through treaties or through national legislation. I think that this is part of the conclusion. The guiding principles are not the end, but really rather the starting point. We are looking at what is going to happen in the future with these guiding principles. Many of the participants highlighted the weaknesses of the third pillar and access to remedy. We discussed this yesterday, I believe. Effective grievance mechanisms do not seem to be as developed as international human rights. Therefore, there they emphasized the need for a grievance mechanism to be developed. Finally, they spoke about the lack of mentions of minority groups or indigenous peoples. In Latin America, these peoples are directly linked with violations of human rights, and they did not seem to be treated in the guiding principles enough.
Thank you for this sharing your results of your findings, actually, the opinions of the organizations in your network. You already commented a bit that there's also some reluctance, or the guiding principles are not by everybody welcomed that much. And we've seen some reluctance with some organizations from the human rights community to actually engage in the mandate of the current working group. Can you explain where this reluctance comes from?
Okay. Me parece que
Well, I think that everybody has their opinion on this issue, and my answer is not going to be of any surprise, I believe. Many organizations, and this was mentioned yesterday many times during our debate, started working in the process of international standards to ensure corporate social responsibility and the respect of human rights. We had a draft of a treaty, and we were working on this treaty, and at the end we ended up with the guiding principles. This was a process that was very frustrating for many human rights organizations that work directly with victims of abuses. I don't think I think people that were here yesterday, if they listened to Rosa and they heard her story about trying to get access to justice, I think that everybody can understand where she was coming from. All the people that worked directly with the victims felt very frustrated with the result of the guiding principles, and they still want to have a discussion, a very strong discussion at the United Nations about some sort of strict enforcement and real recourse. If all the discussions focused themselves on how to implement the guidelines and only how to implement these guiding principles, then these discussions only on implementation leave aside many people that have a critical vision of these guiding principles. I don't think that we should really look at in depth about the implementation, but how to ensure that there is recourse and there are grievance mechanisms in place that work. To make sure that all human rights activists work in this field, we need to be a bit more critical, and we need to look at the lacks, the gaps in the guiding principles, and the people that have a more critical voice are the ones that are the closest to the victims, and they are the ones that really should be listened to. I think that as long as there is no space for more criticism, the human rights community will stay far away. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Guana, for this explanation. I think my third question was what you would recommend towards the mandate to actually respond to these concerns. Fortunately, we're out of time, and I think you already actually responded to that in a sense that you stress the working group should not necessarily focus on implementing the guiding principles since this is the instrument, but it's actually about realizing the end goal, and that's business respect for human rights and corporate accountability. So the focus should be there, and you say also it's very important to realize pillar 3, so to really focus on the third pillar and on redress, effective redress for victims of business and human rights abuses.
Can I comment?
Yes. Okay. Well,
Yes. Can I comment short?
very short.
Okay.
Yes.
Que era mi tercer punto.
Yes. The working group is one of the thematic mechanisms of the Human Rights Council. There is no provision in its mandate for the working group not to deal with individual cases or group cases. And I think that in the first and the second report, the working group gave out confusing or contradictory messages if it will deal with specific cases or not. I don't know how they will be able to evaluate the implementation of the guiding principles without having received concrete information directly from victims. One of the ways to ensure that the human rights community comes back into this discussion, the working group must say that they will deal with each case individually or as a group, and that they use all this information from victims in their reports.
Okay, thanks. That was a good clarification. Chris, can I give the word to you?
Is that okay? Thank you, Mariette and Juana. It's my pleasure to introduce Debbie Stothard here on my right. We all heard Debbie speak at the opening session yesterday about men, women, and children who have lost their lives recently for their opposition to company projects in their communities. Since I started working in the human rights field in 1983 at Amnesty International, seldom, if ever, have I heard such a clear and powerful presentation as the one Debbie delivered yesterday about the victims of human rights abuses. Debbie is Malaysian. She is coordinator of the Alternative ASEAN Network on Burma, which is called ALTSEAN Burma for short. And this is an organization she founded in 1996. She also serves as Deputy Secretary General of the International Federation for Human Rights, FEDH. And she has worked as a journalist, government advisor, consultant, and educator in Malaysia, Australia, and Thailand in a career that began in 1981. Debbie, my first question is, what business-related human rights abuses does your organization encounter in Burma specifically and in Southeast Asia generally?
We really face thanks, Chris. Thanks for such a, hang on, is this on? Yeah. Thanks for such a nice intro. We face the whole gamut of human rights abuses linked to business activities. And this is not something that we set out to do. It just happened. Because when people started raising human rights issues with us, it became quite clear there's a consistent pattern going on. In fact, at the press conference yesterday, I warned that not just in Burma, but in many post-conflict situations in Asia, affected communities used to be afraid of soldiers with guns coming to attack them or kill them or rob them. Now they are afraid of men with guns accompanied by men with briefcases. So we have a huge problem with land confiscation or land grabbing, and the majority of communities are agriculturally based. So the land basically is the way they grow food to feed themselves. So this is a very serious problem. We are also seeing abductions, torture, and extrajudicial killings, assassinations of human rights defenders and environmental defenders who question some of these very harmful business activities. So it's basically everything, and we didn't even go and look for it. People came to us.
Thanks, Debbie. My next question, what specific challenges does the conflict setting in Burma pose for business and human rights?
There's a lot of euphoria and excitement over reforms in Burma, but at this point, the main reform that's happening is in the presidential office's publicity machine. Sorry, I sound so cynical, but really, there's not been any shift to the constitution and to other legislation that empower the authorities to do as they like. In fact, there are parts of Article 445 in the Burmese constitution actually provides immunity from prosecution for security forces retroactively as well, including retroactively. And many articles in the Constitution combine to provide executive and executive control in the central government over land, natural resources, justice, health and education everywhere in the country. And land and natural resources have been the main factors of conflict and displacement in the country for the past 2 decades. So what we're seeing now is new laws that sound very positive, but when you look in the nitty-gritty, it actually legalizes arbitrary land confiscation, particularly in ethnic areas. I spoke to one of the Karen team that went to have peace negotiations with the authorities, and they confided that they were very concerned. Official maps of the country do not recognize occupation of land by some ethnic communities even. So that land is basically, those people are not recognized as living or farming on that land. So we are having this very serious problem. The most horrific example was just a few days ago at Monua, where local people and monks were protesting a copper mine, and the local authorities came and used tear gas as well as phosphorus bombs against the local people. So people were very severely burned. They're there's very horrific pictures online. And when we look at that, and then the president says, "Oh, I'm sorry, we had to do this because of rule of law," then we start to see there is a dark side to this very euphoric situation. It's not on.
You need to press hard. Yeah.
I'm trying to press this off.
Why don't you speak in here?
Okay. Thanks, Debbie. We just have one more minute, but to what extent do you consider the UN Guiding Principles useful to addressing business-related abuses in Burma and in Southeast Asia?
Okay. We're working in a context where we have to use bullet points to deal with bullets. So every time I look at a new statement, declaration, or framework that comes out, we're looking for bullet points that can be used by affected communities to say, hey, business, hey, government, you got to listen to us. You actually have to recognize our right to speak to you. You have to recognize our right to seek remedy. So I think in that respect, I give 15 to 20 training workshops to grassroots organizers and activists a year. And I've already started looking at how we can incorporate those elements and say, okay, if you want to argue, if you want to nicely ask the government not to do this, or you want to nicely ask this company to slow down and talk to you, you can invoke the guiding principles. But the reality also is that in our region, people who would potentially be the main advocates for the guiding principles at community and national level are the ones being targeted with acts of impunity. They are the ones who are being criminalized, and that's why I raised this issue in the opening session yesterday, that impunity is the biggest threat, not just to activists and communities, but also to the implementation of the guiding principles.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Mariette, back to you.
Yes, then it is my great pleasure to introduce to you our third panelist, and that's Sergey Yannick. He's a consultant for Crude Accountability, which is a non-governmental organization focused on environmental justice in the Caspian Sea, and the organization is based in Kazakhstan. Sergey has been active in the environmental movement since 1990, and his focus is on protecting the human right to a healthy environment and monitoring and influencing the activities of transnational corporations and international financial institutions operating in Kazakhstan and throughout Central Asia. Well, first of all, Sergey, we haven't heard a lot about Central Asia at all at this forum. In fact, in the business and human rights debate, I rarely hear about the situation in Central Asia. So could you just describe for us what the business-related human rights situation is in your region?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for possibility to participate in this event, and I would like to start my short speech about general description of human rights situation in Kazakhstan and Central Asia, just to understand how guiding principle could be applied or not applied in the region. First of all, any political and economical modernization of the Central Asia states that took place after the fall of the Soviet Union has completely fallen apart. A facade of democracy has been created in the countries of the region as show for the outside world. This is accompanied by general degradation of state institutions and repression of civil and economical freedoms by political authorities. Widespread tribalism hinders the creation of legal state and stifles business. Foreign companies and local business are not free from threats of loss of their property. Society is completely isolated from political mechanism to create and influence authority. There is practically no political opposition and independent media in the region. The judiciary system in the countries of the region is completely dependent on the authorities and has become an instrument of repression against political opponents, independent thinkers, and punishment of economic competition. The situation is made more difficult because of complete corruption, which rules at all levels of authority.
Okay, well, that actually feeds already into my second question. Because you bring on the subject of corruption, which is a main obstacle, I would think, in realizing business respect to human rights. Could you elaborate on the obstacles faced for your organization and rights holders in realizing their rights?
Yes, through our activity, I would like to touch a little bit the role of transnational corporations in our region, because the firm position of transnational companies in the region is the result of their special relationship with leaders of our countries, which is based on corruption. For example, I could suggest you a very famous case dealing with Kazakh Gate and so on, involvement of high-level officials of Kazakhstan in bribery from very famous oil companies of the world, just to get access to oil and gas fields in Kazakhstan. And I would like to underline that companies relate to human rights issue in the region in the same way that authorities relate to human rights. Frequently, under the facade of responsibility, the companies hide unattractive facts of human rights violation of residents, workers, and massive environmental pollution. For example, I prepare for this meeting just two examples, just to demonstrate to you their relation to the local community and to the oil workers. The first example, the village of Berezovka. We directly involved in this campaign during 10 years. The village of Berezovka, which is located in western Kazakhstan, more than 1,000 people live there. The village is located dangerously close to the Karachaganak oil and gas condensate field, which exploited by the international consortium Karachaganak Petroleum Operating. The companies Eni, British Gas, Chevron, and Lukoil are members of the consortium. The project is causing serious environmental degradation and threats to human rights of local villages. Since 2002, residents have unsuccessfully tried to convince the government and consortium to legally relocate the village in safe and environmentally clean place. Only 2 families have been able to obtain relocation due to litigation against the government. It was unique legal case, maybe the first public case against the government of Kazakhstan. We won it, but only 2 families reach so-called justice. However, I would like to underline, the decision of the court to relocate them has not been implemented, even so 2 years have already gone by. And another case, maybe you heard, it's in hot political news right now in Kazakhstan and outside in Kazakhstan, especially in the former Soviet Union, Zhanaozen case. A year ago, about in 2 weeks, we'll celebrate so-called dark date. A year ago, 17 people were killed and over 100 were injured in this oil town in western Kazakhstan. And these people could be added to the list of Debbie. The police shot walkies and peaceful residents on December 16th last year. It was the day of independence. It was a big celebration in the country during this day. The authorities claimed that the walkies, activists and independent journalists were responsible for the tragedy. The incident started with peaceful walkie strikes and lasted 7 months, during which walkies demanded adequate salary. Neither the employers, a Kazakh and Chinese company, nor the government engaged with strikers. Following the event in Zhanaozen, the lawyer for strikers walkies was sued by the government and given 6-year sentence for so-called inciting social discord. In January of this year, massive arrests took place. Walkies were tortured and were given varying prison sentences. The politician Vladimir Kozlov, a leader of the opposition party Alga in Kazakhstan, was given sentence 7 years for helping oil workers defend their legal rights. At present time, the authorities, based on the decision of the court of Zhanaozen, have begun a campaign to close some opposition parties, organizations, and independent mass media. I would like to underline this occurred immediately after Kazakhstan was accepted into the UN Council on Human Rights. And I would like to touch in the end of this part to the role of international body in protection of human rights. Because yesterday there was a good presentation of my colleague with Office of Ombudsman of IFEC. And I would like to add my 5 cents to this presentation. Unfortunately, existing international bodies are not in position to recommend to regional population any adequate human rights protection mechanism and constraints on authorities to fulfill their existing obligation regarding human rights. One example is Committee for Fulfilling the Norm of the Aarhus Convention, which is based here in Geneva. We have a long story to communicate with Aarhus Convention, and also we won several cases here in Geneva. In Kazakhstan, local officials don't fulfill recommendations and this committee. And another example is the Office of the Ombudsman of the International Financial Corporation, which I mentioned above, where 3 complaints of Berezovka villages were sent.
Yes, very quickly then our last question, because you describe a situation which is quite problematic, I could say, to say the least. What do the guiding principles add for you to what extent are they useful in your strive for environmental justice?
Unfortunately, if you look at the authorities of our regime and region, I'm afraid this outward appearance threatens to guiding principles in the countries of the region. The authorities may sign on it, but they will not implement them in reality because there is no political will to change the situation with human rights. There is maybe a small opportunity for business to implement the principles. This includes companies, maybe only a few companies which work in the region, who care about the image and for whom the loss of that image could lead to the serious financial loss in investor market, first of all, investor market. It's my general.
Thank you very much, Sergey. Back to you, Chris.
Chris, just 1 minute. Oh dear. May I please request people from the floor to add their names to the list if you would like to interact with the panelists. The list will close after the last panelist has spoken. So please, I encourage you to add your names. Thank you.
It's my pleasure now to introduce our last panelist, Wellington Shibebe, on my left. In September 2011, Wellington was appointed Deputy General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation. Before that, he was Secretary General of the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions for 10 years. He chaired the Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition in 2005 to 2006, and was board member of the National Constitutional Assembly in Zimbabwe in 2009 to 2011. He has won 4 international human rights awards, and Wellington is known for having a passion for human rights and for being a courageous human rights defender in Zimbabwe under difficult circumstances. Wellington, my first question for you, can you describe the main business-related human rights issues facing the trade union movement in Africa specifically, as well as the more general international issues?
Thank you, Chris, and good morning, everyone. My reaction to that is premised on the fact that we say in the trade union movement, trade union rights are human rights. And from that perspective, it is common knowledge from the trade union's perspective that the tendency we see from business is that they demand investor-friendly laws or labor flexibility as a condition for investment. And these laws or demands have been used, particularly in Africa, for the plunder of Africa's resources. I'm saying this from an emotional point of view. And coupled with that, there is non-recognition of trade union rights, particularly Convention 87 and 98, freedom of association, right to organize, and right to collective bargaining, which are the pillars of the survival of trade unions. And on an international perspective, I could give an example of Qatar, where the majority of the workforce are migrant labor. And in terms of ITUC investigations, they may come to 1.2 million migrant laborers, and they have no rights at all in Qatar. In April, I was in Gabon attending a conference on New York Africa Forum, at which Chinese business announced that they are migrating to Africa, and they may take with them 5 million jobs from China. And the reason, the Chinese labor movement are now able to negotiate in terms of collective bargaining, and therefore they are looking for safe havens in Africa. Reintroduction of modern day slavery. And from a human and trade union rights, that's worrisome, that we don't want jobs, but we want just jobs to ensure justiciable and equitable distribution of economic hardships and the wealth in the world. I think in a nutshell, that's what I can say for now for Africa and the world.
Thank you, Wellington. My last question for you. The trade union movement has been equipped with the ILO standards for decades. What do the guiding principles add to the protection of workers' rights in your view? In other words, how are the guiding principles useful for the trade union movement?
My reaction and entry point to that question is the recognition by the guiding principles of the existence of the ILO and recognition of the ILO fundamental principles. That being said, it is also worth noting that the guiding principles are considered to be complementary to the ILO fundamental principles, ILO conventions, and we don't believe and we hope they will not supplant the ILO conventions or the role of the ILO by the true fact that they recognize the existence of the ILO, which has been in existence and a pillar for the defense of the rights of the workers and societies in general. Point number 2, the guiding principles, in our view, confer duty on business. And the ILO conventions confer duty on governments in terms of human and trade union rights. And therefore, we find that they give each other space, but mindful of the fact that the spaces should be recognized and respected. We are saying this from a perspective of what happened during this year's ILC conference, where we could not have hearings in the Standards Committee simply because of an issue of interpretation of the ILO statutes vis-a-vis the right to strike. And the people who raised the issue were the business colleagues. And if business colleagues could raise an issue on such a fundamental issue in terms of interpretation, how then will we trust each other in terms of usefulness going way forward in terms of guiding principles? And they are guiding principles. While the language is preemptory in terms of must, shall, but in terms of the title, they are guiding principles. Yet the conventions are actually preemptory in terms of text and in terms of deed. So we believe and hope that the guiding principles may be very useful, assuming that they are respected in letter and in spirit. Because the interpretation aspect, even in the courts of law, you find that lawyers from different platforms, they argue on the basis of interpretation, on the basis of the 3 principles of interpretation: textual, contextual, and purposive. And we believe that from this perspective, our colleagues from business will take the guiding principles in good spirit and from a persuasive nature, respect human and trade union rights, not to be frog-marched to actually respect human and trade union rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wellington. And Jyoti, back to you.
Thank you very much, Mariette, Chris, and really thank you very much to the panelists for bringing some excellent points for discussion. I am now going to request our member from the working group, Mr. Pavel Sulyan-Ziga, to take about 4 minutes to raise some critical issues in regards to what has come up. The floor is still open for registering your names as speakers, and then we will go for an open interaction. Thank you. Over to you.
Спасибо большое. Добрый день.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Yes, I'd like to thank all those who made a presentation and reports From my point of view, I would like to hear more, but I would like to share some of my views as well, some of my considerations. In the first place, we must understand well that the guiding principles are something new in regard of questions of defense of human rights against business. The Guiding Principles is a very important strategic document which traces a certain thrust, a certain vector. We discussed in a working group the question related to the expectations and reactions of various stakeholders to the Guiding Principles issue. And we must stress that I, for example, represent in the working group the autochthonous or indigenous peoples. And of course, for me, as someone dealing with the rights of such minorities, have several important documents upon which we base our defense work. The first of all, this is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But as regards the relationship between indigenous people and business, one of the most important documents is the policies and directives of the important organizations in the World Bank, EBRD, the Inter-American Bank for Development, which state clearly that the organization, the business that wishes to obtain money from this structure must respect the rights of indigenous peoples. The EBRD has included an article from the UN Declaration on such rights. Therefore, for us, people and organizations dealing with the rights of such peoples, the Guiding Principles is one of the instruments we can use for defending human rights. A very important instrument which opens broad possibilities for negotiations and development of mechanisms which give access to remedy in the first place. This is a very important document where we have to develop our own initiative for the development of mechanisms, specific mechanisms in this direction. Therefore, as regards civil society, its role in achieving and defending human rights leads to the need of developing mechanisms for having access to courts of law, for recognizing an exterritorial principle, for attempting to develop criterion mechanisms for monitoring, for judging how corporations respect human rights. From this point of view, I think that the Guiding Principles is a very important first step towards our working further for this end. Once again, thank you very much. With your permission, I would like to echo Sergey's statement. I would like to make a specific comment about my own region. What Sergey said, he described very accurately the situation in post-Soviet period, ex-Soviet countries. For some people, it's a little difficult to understand what is happening in our countries, because there are beautiful, wonderful statements about democracy, about wonderful life. In the Soviet Union, it was much simpler. The Soviet Union declared what its position was which was wrong half of the time, but the position was stated clearly, and you could fight it, etc. In our region, we have the following. Something is stated, declared, something else is happening, and yet another thing is thought in the minds of those people. So the position is extremely complex, and in order to understand it, you have to really go in deeply into events and into what is happening. Thank you very much.